All right, everyone, I want to give us an introduction to sociology in this video. So we're going to talk about what sociology is in the most abstract sense. That's going to give us an orientation to then moving into the course content for the rest of the semester and figuring out how to think sociologically. So think of this as the core introduction to how to think sociologically, how to use your sociological imagination. Okay. So what is sociology? This is a kind of a big question, but I want to boil sociology down to one basic proposition. And that is that society is the thing that makes us human. Society is the thing that makes us human. We are a social species. To talk about human beings is to talk about the web of social relationships in which we are enmeshed, the social institutions with which we engage, the culture and social interactions we're partaking in and a part of. Those things define who we are. It makes no sense to talk about human beings without talking about the social context around us. So that is the core of sociology. We investigate the social context around human beings that defines who we are. We are not human beings in some abstracted asocial context. We are who we are because of those social relationships, those interactions, the culture, and the institutions that we find ourselves belonging to. In the absence of all of those things, we are not recognizably human. We aren't defined by some natural social instincts. Now, that may seem odd to us. We often think about ourselves as individuals who have particular characteristics and are defined by our inner kind of qualities. And this is to some extent, I think, the case, but really those things are impacted more than we recognize by the social context around us. So how can we sort of square that? How can we make sense of that? Let me talk about a couple of experiments that help us see the real value of thinking sociologically about ourselves. One comes from two psychologists in the 1960s, Harry and Margaret Harlow. Now, what the Harlows did was they took a set of rhesus monkeys and they put them in isolation. They put them in isolation away from the contact with any other rhesus monkeys. And they gave them two mothers. One of those is the mother that they fed from. It was a wire framing. It had a bottle you can see at the top of it, and that's how they got their basic sustenance. The other mother they covered with a terry cloth, right? And so this provided a sort of soft base then around this second mother. And then they did something that we may find deplorable now, but I think it tells us a lot about the importance of society or of social relationships and social interactions. They then scared those baby monkeys. They used a mechanical bear or a dog to sort of to frighten these monkeys that were in isolation, and they noticed something really important. Whenever they did this, the monkey would then jump onto this terry cloth mother, right? Why would they actually do this? You might think, well, they're getting their food from the wire mother, right? Don't bite the hand that feeds you. You know, this phraseology. But in fact, they jump towards this terry cloth mother. Rather than going to the source of sustenance, of food, they instead go to the source of what they framed as intimate physical contact. Now, they did something else after this. They took those monkeys after they had frightened them probably several times, and they then tried to integrate them into a group of a pre-existing group of rhesus monkeys. And they found that they were completely unable to interact in this group setting. They couldn't play fight properly. They couldn't even have sexual intercourse with the other monkeys. And ultimately, the other monkeys then rejected them. And in a very harrowing next step, the Harlows actually impregnated some of these monkeys and found that they were completely unable to mother effectively. They kicked, struck, and crushed their babies on the cage floor. This seems rather tragic, and I think there's something perhaps even unethical about it. But what does it tell us about ourselves? Well, one of the sort of conclusions we can draw from that is that we are our social relationships. In the absence of social relationships, in the absence of social interaction, that is, in the absence of the social context around us, we, like these monkeys, would not be recognizably who we think of ourselves as. Now, you might be thinking, oh, well, these are just rhesus monkeys, right? I mean, what do they have to do with human beings? Well, let's take a look at another experiment. This comes from two psychologists, Skeels and Dye, in the 1930s. Now, in the 1930s, orphanages were a much more common occurrence. And one of the things that people noticed is that those children who were raised in those orphanages tended to display very low IQs, right? And so one explanation is, well, maybe those kids are just naturally unintelligent. Maybe they're just dumber than the rest of us. But Skeels and Dye were not satisfied with that explanation and suspected there was something else about the social context around them that was doing it. So they randomly took 13 infants who were in an Iowa orphanage. All of them were around 19 months of age, and they placed them in an institute for mentally disabled women. And the women in that institute ranged from ages 18 to 50, being mentally roughly between ages 5 and 12. The researchers then left a control group of infants at the Iowa orphanage, and then they wanted to see what happened to these kids after about 2 years down the road. And what they found was that those kids who were raised in the new institute of the mentally disabled women had gained about 28 IQ points, while those at the orphanage in Iowa had lost about 30 IQ points. They then tracked them out over the course of their lives and found that those who were raised with the women in the institute, by adulthood, most of them had completed more education. 11 of them had gotten married, and all 13 of them were self-supporting. Those in the control group, where they had left them at the Iowa orphanage, averaged around a third grade education. Only 2 of them ever got married, and 4 of them still lived in a state institution by that period of time. So what was different here? What was going on? Well, those who went to that institute where there were the mentally disabled women present, they got a lot of interaction. They formed relationships with them as something like a mother figure. Those women really bonded with them. They felt responsibility towards them. They worked with them. They interacted with them. They played with them. At that institute, they had competitions to see who could get their kid to walk first or talk first. So they spent a lot of time and attention on those kids. At the Iowa orphanage, these kids were basically left in their cribs unattended for hours at a time and received very little social interaction and contact with others. So again, we can see here the importance of building those social relationships, the importance then of social context, the importance of social interaction and developing in the context of a culture, right? Developing in the context of a set of people who are committed to you, a set of people who are interacting with you and engaging with you. These social relationships, these social interactions came to define and make them more recognizably human and to enable them to flourish as human beings. So society is the thing that makes us human. We are a social species, and we are defined by and made through our social context. We become who we are in the context of a set of social relationships, social institutions, culture, and social interactions that come to make us recognizably human. So that's the core of sociology, to understand how those different social contexts play out and how they shape individual lives. You'll see that we're going to spend a great deal of time focusing on those specific social contexts. The core idea, though, is to think outside of the individual, to think beyond the individual composition of a person, to think about the social context that is around them. And it's through understanding that context that we can then understand ourselves and those around us. All right, so we'll talk more about this as we go along.